You know, over the past few months, we've been hearing more and more about something called Project 2025. And some have described it as the agenda for the Trump administration if he becomes president again. Trump himself has denied that. But either way, it's getting enough attention that it seems important that we know more about it. So my goal for today is to give you an overview of what Project 2025 is all about. So Project 2025 is fundamentally a transition plan for the next Republican president. There were complaints in 2016 that the Trump administration was not really prepared to assume office upon his election, maybe because he didn't think he was going to win, I don't know. But there were a lot of delays in appointing his people and implementing his agenda. So Project 2025 is an attempt to be the solution to that problem. Now, it's a conservative group called the Heritage Foundation is spearheading this effort. And the Heritage Foundation is a nonprofit think tank. It was founded in 1973, and they came with a mission to formulate and promote conservative public policies. Now, for this project, Heritage has recruited more than 100 conservative groups to serve on the advisory board, so it has a lot of attention across the conservative universe. And additionally, at least 140 former Trump administration officials have contributed to this project. Now, Project 2025, they describe themselves as consisting of 4 pillars. And the first pillar is a policy guide that lays out an overhaul of the executive branch of the federal government. And that's what we will spend most of our time on today, discussing this book and what's in it. But pillar number 2 is a database intended to collect the resumes of the personnel needed to support the new administration. And the policy guide itself demands that the president, quote, ensure appointees agree with this administration's aims. So the database is intended to supply the ideologically compatible personnel that this administration will need to carry out its policies. Now, pillar number 3 is what they call the Presidential Administration Academy. And this academy is intended to train those selected from the database on the goals of the administration, as well as how to be effective in a bureaucracy. And finally, pillar number 4 is an action list for the administration in its first 180 days. Now, most of the focus and criticism of Project 2025 involves its first pillar, and that is the over 900-page policy guide that describes the changes needed in the executive branch. And this book is called The Mandate for Leadership 2025, The Conservative Promise. And it builds on previous books, also titled Mandate for Leadership, that have been serving as roadmaps for incoming Republican administrations since 1981. So I'll be referring to this policy guide as either the guide or the plan or the mandate, just in order to be clear that Project 2025 is larger than just the policy guide. While the Heritage Foundation has been producing a policy guide for years, Project 2025 is larger than that, because it includes the recruiting and training of loyalists for the new Trump administration and also supplies that 180-day action plan. While the size of the document alone discourages most folks from trying to read it, the breadth of the subject matter it covers is also intimidating. And here is the table of contents of the Mandate for Leadership 2025. I mean, that print's a little small, but this will give you some feel of why it is so difficult to boil this down to something you can really get your head around. The document's organization is to go agency by agency and explain what changes need to be made in each department. So even deciding what departments you want to talk about or what you would look at is a major decision. So I would certainly have a hard time recommending that anyone try to read the entire document. However, for anyone who is passionate about a certain issue and wants to read the project's recommendation on their issue, this table of contents may serve you. You simply need to identify those agencies that address your issue and target them for reading. So for example, if the environment is your issue, then clearly you would read the chapter on the Environmental Protection Agency. Now, for my approach today, I'm going to try and identify some overall themes that are woven throughout the entire document, and then to focus on certain issues that seem worthy of the most attention. And that's my judgment. But one of the more startling things that you find when you're working your way through the guide is how much Christian and biblical worldview permeates the writing. The mandate assumes that America is Christian and that Christianity and its beliefs should have privileged place in society over other religions and civil law. The guide seeks to infuse the government and society with conservative Christian values. And so here's just a few examples. The mandate assumes fetal personhood. That is, a fertilized egg is a person and deserving of all rights of a fully formed human being. Interestingly, they even want to rename the Department of Health and Human Services the Department of Life. So the mandate states the U.S. should, quote, maintain a biblically based, social science reinforced definition of marriage and family. So that is, what we're talking about is heterosexual, two-parent families only, where the husband is the head of the home and the wife submits to her husband. Yes, yes. My wife isn't here, so I can say that. Additionally, the plan says, quote again from the plan, families comprised of married mother, father, and their children are the foundation of a well-ordered nation and healthy society. And the message here is clearly intending a shift towards policies that would support this family structure exclusively and potentially marginalizing other family situations. Now, the guide only accepts two sexes, men and women. The mandate envisions a federal government that denies the existence of transgender people, undermines the rights of same-sex married couples, and dismantles services for LGBTQ+ Americans whenever possible. And one more. The mandate calls for a reinstatement of recognizing Sunday and as an explicitly work-free day of worship. The book reminds us that, quote, God ordained the Sabbath as a day of rest, and until very recently, the Judeo-Christian tradition sought to honor that mandate. So let's begin with our overview of the guide, and we're going to talk about its intention to crack down on immigration. The mandate first calls for the elimination of the DACA program, that is the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. This is the program which allows those who migrated to the United States as children to avoid deportation and obtain permission to work here. The guide also seeks to abolish family-based immigration. That is the system that allows U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents, that is those who hold a green card, to sponsor certain family members for immigration to the United States. The mandate removes prohibitions on immigration and customs enforcement acting in sensitive zones. Thus, ICE is being allowed to raid on schools, hospitals, and religious institutions. The mandate makes it easier to detain unaccompanied children in less than optimal conditions. Courts require that unaccompanied minors be held in the least restrictive setting possible. The mandate calls on Congress to rescind that court settlement, allowing large numbers of children to once again be held in the ICE facilities as opposed to those provided by the Department of Health and Human Services. It also recommends that laws guaranteeing certain protections for migrant children be repealed so that those children can be deported more easily. The mandate suspends much of the due process that allows immigrants to have their day in court. First, they want to expand the use of what is called an expedited removal process. And normally it runs within 100 miles of the border that this program goes, but they want to extend it to the entire country. This is a show me your papers style program that would require ICE to remove, arrest, and detain immigration violators anywhere in the country and without a warrant. They want to give Homeland Security the authority to declare a mass migration event at the border, which then allows the government to take any action to avert that crisis, up to and including scrapping all the Title VIII laws surrounding immigration. They also want to allow the immediate expulsion of migrants in the case of what they call loss of operational control. It is not a well-defined term, but suggests that when there is a breakdown of the entire immigration system, they can immediately expel everyone. The plan would also require local law enforcement to participate in border security actions and penalize those jurisdictions that do not comply. So, moving beyond the suspension of due process, the mandate encourages the use of the U.S. military to crack down on migrants arriving at the border. The proposal also considers using the military to engage in war with the drug cartels in Mexico. Now, also, the mandate seeks to restrict legal immigration by barring certain groups or nationalities from accessing work and student visas. It eliminates the temporary protected status program that provides asylum for those fleeing wars, internal conflicts, criminal gangs, and natural disasters. So let's talk for a minute about the efforts to combat climate change and how they will be weakened. Much of what the EPA does is tied to a 2009 endangerment finding that requires the EPA to take action under the Clean Air Act to curb emissions of carbon dioxide, methane, and 4 other heat-trapping pollutants. The mandate wants to update that endangerment finding in a way that restricts the federal government's obligation to combat climate change. Now, according to the mandate, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration is, quote, a colossal operation that has become one of the main drivers of the climate change alarm industry and as such is harmful to the future of U.S. prosperity. Thus, clearly, NOAA must be dismantled. Disbanding NOAA would eliminate a significant source of quality climate information used to guide the U.S. in combating climate change. Next, the mandate advocates shifting climate-related funds in the recently passed Inflation Reduction Act away from organizations with a climate change focus and towards state regulatory entities. So this opens the possibility that state officials not committed to climate sustainability, or even those who may deny climate change altogether, could misuse those funds in a way that would set back climate action. The mandate wants to conduct offshore oil and natural gas lease sales to the maximum extent permitted under the 2023-2028 lease program. This proposal would allow fossil fuel companies to drill on more public lands and waters, undoing much of the previous progress. The plan proposes removing the U.S. from international climate change agreements, and the mandate proposes to eliminate the EPA's Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights, and eliminating this office would put the communities that have historically borne the brunt of pollution and climate change at increased risk. Okay, let's talk about abortion access and how that's going to be restricted. Now, the mandate does not explicitly call for a national abortion ban, but the policies it advocates are designed to limit access to abortion across the country. And I tell you, every tool of the government will be engaged in suppressing abortion, including even the removal of such words as reproductive health, reproductive rights, and abortion from every single federal rule, agency regulation, contract, grant, regulation, and piece of legislation that exists. In other words, it doesn't exist. And woven through all the mandates' discussion of abortion are 2 beliefs. that every fetus is a person and deserving of legal rights, and abortion is not health care. As their number one goal, the guide says, the Secretary must ensure that all health and human services programs and activities are rooted in a deep respect for innocent human life from day one, meaning conception. The proposed policies will impact not only abortions, but also some forms of birth control and assisted fertility treatments like in vitro fertilization. So specifically, it is recommended that the FDA reverses the 20-year-old approval of the widely used abortion pill, mifepristone, and additionally, mifepristone should be dispensed in person instead of through the mail or by telemedicine appointments. The mandate also recommends the Justice Department enforce the Comstock Act against providers and distributors of abortion pills. The Comstock Act is from 1873 and is a so-called zombie law, still on the books but rarely enforced. And that law prohibits drugs, medicines, or instruments used in abortions from being sent through the mail. So essentially they want to revive that zombie law. It proposes to improve CDC's abortion surveillance data collection system through expanding the amount of data collected from the states and making this currently voluntary system mandatory. Some worry that this system would be capable of tracking everyone who is pregnant in the U.S., resulting in a disturbing government intrusion into people's private lives. The mandate also has some additional ideas about health care that I think will reduce access and increase costs. The Inflation Reduction Act recently gave Medicare the ability to negotiate lower prescription drug prices for seniors. You think a good thing for reducing health care costs. The mandate's plan is to specifically instruct Congress to repeal this ability to negotiate drug prices. Several of the project's proposals would push people towards private Medicare alternatives. The mandate sees these Medicare reforms as encouraging consumer choice, but many believe this will put at risk the health of seniors enrolled in the traditional Medicare plan. Further, the guide calls for caps on the federal funding that states may receive to help pay for Medicare costs. Medicaid costs, it's Medicaid. And the caps would likely prevent Medicaid spending from keeping pace with expected enrollment increases and future health care costs. Additionally, they would put lifetime caps. They would be imposed on the benefits to, quote, disincentivize permanent dependence by our citizens. States would also be allowed to establish what they call more robust eligibility requirements, meaning basically more work requirements for people to qualify for coverage. Next, we'll look at how the guide would impair the government's ability to function effectively. The mandate proposes that the entire federal bureaucracy, including independent agencies such as the Department of Justice, be placed under the direct presidential control, thus reducing their independence. The guide calls for eliminating job protections for thousands of government employees who would be fired and then replaced by political appointees. And while the vast majority of civil servants already live and work outside of Washington, D.C., the mandate proposes to relocate Washington, D.C.-based offices as a means to encourage long-serving nonpartisan experts to quit so they can be replaced with more ideologically compatible employees. As mentioned earlier, Project 2025 is creating a database of individuals who will fill the federal bureaucracy. And registration for this database includes a questionnaire which evaluates candidates through ideologically based questions. Now, if you want to have some fun, you might submit yourself to the database and see if you can get past the ideological litmus tests. I know at least one person who's already done that. They would also reinstate the usage of general intelligence tests, which were abolished in the Carter administration as discriminatory. The overall outcome is likely to be replacing experts with partisan loyalists. So on to how we're going to limit federal support for education. The mandate wants to limit the federal government's ability to provide student loans, taking away the ability of parents of college students to take out Parent Plus loans, graduate students to take out Graduate Plus loans, and the undocumented immigrants to take out any federal loans. So as the cost of higher education soars, limiting access to stable student loans will reduce the ability of people from all backgrounds to access higher education. The mandate emphasizes that any definition of sex under Title IX should mean only biological sex assigned at birth. Now, Title IX is the law that prohibits sex-based discrimination in education. This understanding forces the Secretary of Education to rescind the Biden administration's expanded Title IX protections for LGBTQ+ students and restore the more aggressive rules previously imposed by the Trump administration. And for those of you who are not deep in Title IX, those protections did away with policies that excluded individuals from sex-separated activities and facilities, even when they matched the individual's chosen gender identity. So this was the issue that addressed bathrooms and locker rooms and other extracurricular activities. So these actions threaten to reestablish the risks faced by transgender, non-binary, and gender non-conforming students. The Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights has recently required all charter schools to enhance the accuracy of student demographic data collection by requiring that the schools provide non-binary as an option for students to self-report themselves. Additionally, OCR instructed charter schools to eliminate data collection that represents school sports teams as purely male or female, and thus excluding non-binary or gender non-conforming students. The mandate would advise the Department of Education to reverse those changes and go back to the way it was previously. The mandate wants to redirect Title I funding, which is specifically for low-income schools. Instead of low-income schools, it would give the states the leeway to spend that money for whatever they wanted as long as it relates to education, but it doesn't necessarily have to be for low-income schools. And finally, the mandate suggests a conservative president should dismantle the Department of Education. At most, they think it should be the department should be a statistics gathering agency that disseminates information to the states. The mandate would discontinue efforts to promote diversity and reduce discrimination. The mandate seeks to eliminate all diversity, equity, and inclusion-related positions, policies, and programs. Nearly all agency-specific chapters in the mandate mention that any efforts to promote diversity or recognize the existence of LGBTQ+ people should be ended. For example, any staff of the Agency for International Development that, quote, engage in ideological agitation on behalf of the DEI agenda should be terminated. Even words are the enemy, as the guide calls for removing words such as sexual orientation, gender identity, diversity, equity, inclusion, gender equality, gender equity, gender awareness, and gender sensitivity. And they want to eliminate it from every federal rule, agency regulation, contract, grant, regulation, and piece of legislation that exists. It proposes that the federal government halt the long-standing use of disparate impact in assessing discrimination. Disparate impact is where a seemingly neutral policy or practice has a disproportionately negative effect on a protected group. This standard provides an important legal remedy to bring civil rights cases in areas such as employment discrimination and fair housing. So obviously discontinuing its use will make it harder for the federal government to enforce civil rights protections. And again, the Department of Health and Human Services should as I think we said this one before, maintain a biblically based, social science reinforced definition of marriage and family, further promoting discrimination against non-traditional families. The mandate would instruct the Department of Health and Human Services to repeal a 2016 regulation that provides additional protections for foster youth related to sexual orientation and gender identity. It would make it easier for state and child welfare agencies to subject children in their care to the whims of extreme religious beliefs. And the mandate would allow businesses, healthcare workers, and adoption agencies to discriminate if something goes against their conscience. For example, those with jobs that would normally require them to play a part in same-sex unions or gender-affirming care can refuse to participate. Next, how the mandate proposes to cut wages, jobs, and labor protections. In 2024, the Biden administration issued a policy that will qualify over 4 million workers for overtime pay. The Department of Labor did this by raising the overtime threshold, which is the income ceiling under which salaried workers will automatically qualify overtime pay if they work more than 40 hours in a week. The mandate opposes raising this threshold. Instead, it proposes lowering the threshold, thus excluding the newly qualified workers from overtime, as well as abolishing overtime for millions of previously eligible workers. The Economic Development Administration is responsible for investing millions of dollars into infrastructure projects in distressed communities across the nation. The mandate proposes that the EDA grants be consolidated with other programs or even eliminated, which would weaken the ability of the federal government to invest in local job-creating programs across the nations. The authors of the mandate think that young people should be able to work in inherently dangerous jobs that are currently not permitted due to significant safety concerns. The mandate calls for the Department of Labor to weaken the policies that protect young workers from these dangerous jobs. And we have some mandate proposals that will make it harder for America to make ends meet. It recommends reforms that would make it more difficult for people to qualify for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, that is SNAP, or commonly referred to as food stamps. It also wants to roll back the changes made by the Biden administration to increase SNAP benefits over the next 10 years to keep up with rising food costs. The guide further recommends making it harder to qualify for SNAP benefits if the people also happen to receive aid from Temporary Assistance for the Needy Families Program. Head Start is a key federal program that offers free early childhood education, health, and nutrition services to children from low-income families. The mandate proposes eliminating Head Start, thus abolishing services for roughly 800,000 children, 2/3 of whom are Black, Hispanic, and Latino. The mandate proposes that the Department of Veterans Affairs cut costs by having fewer health conditions that qualify veterans for disability benefits. And farmers, they may do great one year and be on the brink of economic failure the next due to the whims of unpredictable weather patterns and market conditions. The government provides safety net programs to help farmers ride out the vagaries of nature. And the mandate wants to restrict these safety net programs to what it calls unusual situations when most of us would consider them fairly common occurrences. The Capital Investment Grants Group play an important role in awarding federal grants to local communities in order to fund infrastructure projects, specifically awarding billions of dollars for key public transportation projects. The mandate wants to eliminate the CIG program, which would make it much harder for Americans without cars to get to work or just join up with family and friends. And we didn't forget about this. We need to take care of the wealthy, right? So the guide wants to make some changes to the federal taxation system that mostly benefit the wealthy. It suggests reducing the 7 tax brackets now in place to 2 at a 15% and a 30% bracket, with the 30% rate kicking in for people who make more than $168,000 and eliminating most deductions, credits, and exclusions. The mandate proposes decreasing the corporate tax rate to 18%. The rate is currently at 21% after the cuts made in the Trump era. And the guide tells us that, quote, the corporate income tax is the most damaging tax in the U.S. tax system. You need to know that. And the guide would reduce the capital gains rate from 20% to 15%, which again, capital gains generally tend to benefit high earners. The guide seeks to make permanent the estate and gift tax exemptions enacted in the Trump era. Additionally, the estate and gift tax rate would be reduced from 40% to 20%. And the mandate also calls for some kind of national consumption tax, like a national sales tax, because as it says, it would be, quote, the least economically harmful way to raise federal tax revenues. And finally, the mandate proposes to increase the politically appointed positions within the Internal Revenue Service from 2 to 8. And the purpose of that is to erode the current impartial nature of the IRS. And here's some miscellaneous items that I thought were worthy of mention, but they did not fit neatly into my other slides. But the mandate, as part of its social policy ideas, wants to criminalize the production, distribution, and consumption of pornography. On the Project 2025 website, the group says that pornography has no claim to First Amendment protection. So this would really challenge decades of free speech precedent as established in the courts. And the mandate wants to eliminate the government's funding for public broadcasting. This would eliminate support for over 1,500 locally controlled and operated public television and radio stations, which would probably cause most of them to close. The guide proposes to end all time-based and occupation-based student loan forgiveness programs. And the biggest one that it includes is the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, which allows public employees such as teachers, firefighters, members of law enforcement, and people who work for nonprofit organizations to apply for forgiveness after they make 10 years' worth of payments. And the mandate wants to privatize the disposal of nuclear waste. Some think that contracting this work out to the lowest bidder may not be the safest approach. So, that is my overview. And now we wonder, what does the Trump campaign think about this? While at least 140 former Trump officials contributed to the project, Trump himself is distancing himself from the project, saying he knows nothing about it or who's in charge of it. And this seems highly unlikely, not only because of the involvement of many of Trump's ex-staffers, but back in April 2022, Heritage Foundation President Kevin Roberts escorted Trump to a conference focusing on Heritage's forthcoming Project 2025 policy proposals. Trump provided the keynote address for this conference and said in his speech that they, meaning the Heritage Foundation, are going to lay the groundwork and detail plans for exactly what our movement will do. Furthermore, Roberts, in an interview this year, claims to have discussed Project 2025 with Trump as part of briefing all the Republican candidates on the project. But this distancing really does make perfect sense, since they're finding that much of what is being proposed is highly unpopular. Yeah, the project has become a potent messaging focus for Democrats, a two-word shorthand for an authoritarian policy agenda that would constitute a second Trump term. And this past month, Heritage buckled a little bit, announcing that the Project 2025's policy operations would cease and its director, Paul Dance, would step down. It is the first step towards patching things up with the one man they've built this whole project to please. But truly, it probably really doesn't matter, because it's obvious there's plenty of overlap between Trump's platform and the goals of Project 2025. The Heritage Foundation produced a similar transition plan for the Trump administration in 2015, and roughly 2/3 of its recommendations were implemented within a year of Trump taking office. So there's little reason to think he will turn away from this one. The main message is that it is not unreasonable to expect the policies documented in the mandate will be the policies of the next Trump administration. So we'll stop there, and if we have some questions or comments.
Thank you from the bottom of my heart for doing this. We needed it. You are a democracy hero.